Our modern idea of short-term mission trips began 60 years ago and has grown in popularity. They're taken by churches, campus ministries, Christian colleges and seminaries, and Christian high schools. More than 2 million people and millions of dollars are spent on short-term trips from the United States alone. But what part do short-term mission trips play in the Great Commission? Should these trips really be considered missions? Are they a springboard for long-term missions? Or is the church spending time, money, and resources on trips where the gospel is not proclaimed, and therefore they become little more than sightseeing vacations? Are they worthwhile or a waste? On this episode of The Mission Table, we'll discuss this contested topic: short-term missions, worthwhile or waste? The Mission Table is a ministry of 1615 Church Missions Coaching, unleashing the potential of churches to reach the nations since 2004. This episode of The Mission Table was brought to you in partnership with Living Water International. Living Water International is a faith-based nonprofit organization that helps communities in developing countries to create sustainable water, sanitation, and hygiene programs in response to the global water crisis. We would also like to thank our sponsors: Shepherd Staff, Avant, Food for the Hungry, Pioneers, Encountering the World of Islam, Perspectives, Missio Nexus, and Ethnos 360.
I'm Matthew Ellison, and this is The Mission Table. I am pleased today to be joined by Dave Wilson, Amy Brown, and Celeste Brown. Dave is the Director of Church Relations at Avant. Celeste is the Manager of Strategic Partnerships at Food for the Hungry. And Amy is an instructor for the Perspectives course. She also serves as a missions mobilizer at Redeemer Burbank, a church that she and her husband planted in 2006. Thank you so much for being here today for this important conversation. So the topic we're going to be addressing today is this: short-term missions, worthwhile or waste? So here's some statistics. In the 60s, short-term missions grew dramatically. And then into the 80s and 90s, the growth continued. It's estimated that today, in upwards of 2 million participants each year from the U.S. alone participate in short-term missions. There's over 1,000 missions organizations in the U.S. and ministries that send people on short-term missions of various kinds. And then you have the tens and thousands of churches that send people on short-term missions, thousands of colleges, high schools, seminaries. So this is a major thing. If you just do some rough numbers, what's $1,000 average per trip times 2 million? Is it 2 billion? I mean, it's an incredible amount of money. So here's my question: are short-term missions worth the time, the trouble, the effort?
I would say yes, when the question of why is asked. Why are we going? Why are we participating globally? My husband and I started a nonprofit about 12 years ago called El Puente. It means the bridge in Spanish. And we were a part of destructive short-term missions at our first ministry assignment when he was an assistant pastor. We took youth groups down to Mexico from Southern California, and we dropped off the candy and we dropped off the toys. And our second or third trip down, there was as we dropped off all of our stuff, as we were leaving, my husband looked in the rearview mirror and there was a fist fight with these kids trying to get the stuff. And the Spirit just used that to be like, what are we doing? What are we a part of? Really started to ask questions. And so then we stopped and started asking Mexicans the questions. What are we doing as the U.S.? What are we doing as an American church? Because of the culture, the Mexican culture, the warm culture that it is, it was difficult and took time and trust to get the honest answer. But when we did, there was a real dependency that the U.S. church was creating in North Mexico. And maybe not creating, but contributing to. And as the church, we needed to ask the question, is that something we want to be a part of? And so we, after some time and relationship building, we moved down to Mexico, and our job, our ministry, was to intercept those teams that were going to come down anyway, and use our our relationship on the ground with Mexican churches, to intercept those teams, and then to help them to effectively partner with Mexican churches, not do American things and have American goals in a country that wasn't our own. And so that seemed to be really fruitful. And all the while, you have the benefit of the goer. And so these youth groups and these teams that would come down who have never crossed the border at all, never gone anywhere outside of the U.S., they're enough out of their comfort zone where my husband would use that opportunity to give them, like, our God is a missionary God, and you don't have to stop here. And so I think there was benefit to those who came, but we firsthand saw the destruction of what, especially a constant flood of short-term missions can do to a culture.
And I've often questioned what does the receiver expect, and what does the receiver actually think of those teams that are coming down? Because as a missions pastor in a church in Southern California, I would take teams across the border to Mexico, and every once in a while I would ask the question of maybe one of the church planters, the pastors that was down there, or one of the missionaries that was serving. And one pastor kind of used a term, he called it pigeonary. And I was just kind of shocked by what's a pigeonary. And he says, well, you know, these missionaries, they come down for a short period of time, they leave a mess all over the place, and then they go back, and then they leave that mess for the long-term missionaries, the workers, the church planters, to clean up afterwards. So that one little term kind of put something in the back of my mind of, what are we doing as the North American church when we go into a place like that? How are we representing ourselves and the kingdom of God that way?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that Amy brought up was the relationship building. So from my point of view, whenever short-term missions happens in the context of a long-term relationship, it's always worthwhile. And I've seen that take place in various ways. So I was a short-term team member after having a bout of a discussion with God where I told him I would never be a missionary. I was called to be one, and decided, okay, I'm going to go on a short-term mission trip to make sure, you know, I can hack it, that this is what I'm really being called to. And that first trip was to visit a missionary from my church, to go and to support her in her work, as well as to do some activities where we tiled the kitchen floor. This was in Kenya. But I think it was a testament for her and the community that she established there in Kenya to say, these are people from my church that came to serve you. And added credibility to her. And just, we were able to demonstrate the love of Christ by being there for her, apart from the fact that we tiled the kitchen floor. Like, obviously the project part of a team is never really what impacts you the most. And of course, all of us were positively impacted ourselves and challenged on that trip. Another way, when I went to Bolivia and I served as a missionary, then I would help receive teams. And the way that we received those was through a church relationship and linking that church to a community similar to what you did in Mexico, and inviting the church to walk alongside the community in a plan that they have for 7 to 10 years of development. And so while the church might have a short-term team that comes 1 year, they're sending teams on a regular basis throughout this time frame, and they're building relationships with the people and in the community. They're being able to impact the lives of those community people. And, you know, as a person who was a part of the organization, we were there to help make sure they didn't make a huge mess that someone else had to clean up afterwards.
So you talk about the importance of this short-term mission being a part of a long-range, long-term vision, and it's done in conjunction with relationships. It's not this, you know, random short-term mission trips all over the place, which unfortunately is the way many churches do them. So to make them worthwhile, what I'm hearing is that they need to be connected to a long-term vision, to long-term partners, right? Let's talk about some of the messes. I mean, these are important things, and we've all maybe been a part of or seen some of those messes get created. Could we surface some of them so that our viewers can avoid making those messes?
I think, the big overarching mess, what you're talking about, is some dependency issues. There's, Haiti is one of those places in the world where dependency. There's so many missions organizations and nonprofits and non-governmental organizations that are serving Haiti, and yet it's still the most impoverished place on earth. I mean, it's such a place that we can't even understand the poverty level, and yet we go in with maybe a different mindset, a Western mindset, a wealthy American mindset, and we can't place ourselves within the context of what the Haitians are experiencing. So all they kind of see is us coming in, trying to fix a problem that's existed there for a long time, and then walking away. So I think dependency is probably one of those things that's happened, at least in that part of the world.
I think arrogance is a part of the mess. I think because of who we are as Americans and what we're allowed to have and all of that, I think that what we saw often was we're not only going to bring clothes and food and toys and candy, we're going to bring the gospel to Mexico. But Mexico already has the gospel, and especially North Mexico. Like, obviously, there are unreached parts of the country, but that part has had the gospel longer than America has, really. So, and to see our arrogance hurt the pastors who are trying to provide for and care for their people was a difficult thing to stomach and be aware of, and caused us as a ministry, when we were there, to put on humility and to ask them what's important to you, not letting our own arrogance and our own Western mindset honestly dictate what's important to the Mexican church. And with that, again, it takes relationship. And with that, though, it takes education, being able to stop and think that we don't know it all and we don't have all the answers, and to go in as a learner, really. And only then can we be part of cleaning up the mess that our arrogance has honestly created.
Yeah, I haven't actually experienced a lot of the messes, but the stories of them were the reason why I told God I could never be a missionary. Because I said, I can't be a part of that. I can't be a part of going somewhere and dishonoring this culture of people. And then he showed me a different way that could be accomplished. And so I think as Americans, it's easy for us to go and think we know what's happening in a place, like you said, in our arrogance. And so I think cross-cultural awareness is key to being able to know that, okay, what you see isn't necessarily what is actually happening, and to know the differences of how direct communication might actually end up being offensive to this culture, depending on where you're going.
I would affirm that. I think one of the biggest messages is caused by a lack of appreciation for the complexities of cross-cultural communication. So the way that you combat that is by educating beforehand. You teach on culture. I think one of the things we struggle with, and it's probably true of every society, but we don't think we have culture as Americans, because we're at the center of the world, right? And a friend of mine says, you have culture when you're in another culture and you feel if something offends you, it's rubbing up against your cultural worldview. And so he says you have to learn about your own culture as you go in, and then you have to learn about their worldview, their culture. And I think you can avoid a lot of the bad rap by teaching on these things.
And when you set the long-term career missionary that sells everything and moves to that place to learn the culture and to be invested in that culture, and you place that scenario next to short-termers that come in just for a period of time, they sometimes don't understand all those cultural cues and those little nuances, the things that culture really is. And the long-term missionary tries to give a good overview before you get there, but something's going to rub, something's going to happen when they're there. And some of those rubs could create messes for the long-term missionary's goals, the things that they're wanting to do. So I think training is one of those necessary variables that you have to put in a short-term mission. And it's got to be from somebody who knows the field, knows what's going on there, and that's a fix to one of those messes. It's just simple culture training.
Yeah, I know many stories, and I won't go into detail here, but horror stories where these teams did more harm than good. There was consequences for the missionary or indigenous church that took years to overcome, and they had spent years building up trust in those communities, and these short-termers came in they're going to win the country in 1 week, or whatever it might be. And maybe well-intentioned, big hearts, but a lack of cultural understanding, a lack of preparation. So let's be positive about short-term missions. Okay, I have to go on record. My life trajectory was completely changed by a short-term missions experience. Yeah. I was following Jesus. A friend of mine invited me on a short-term trip, and I was about 5 or 6 months old in the Lord. Frankly, had no business being overseas as a short-term missionary. I think of my journey in ministry, and I'm like, people gave me a chance, and I didn't deserve one. So I want to be careful here. But at the end of that trip, and there was training, there was debriefing, all the things a trip needs. But at the end of that trip, everything within me said, yes, this is what you were made for. So by God's grace, I became a world Christian through that experience. So we've talked about some horror stories. Let's talk about what makes a short-term mission trip worthwhile. And we've hit on that a little bit as we've addressed some of the messes. But what makes a short-term mission trip worthwhile?
If the sending organization, the church or the mission organization that's sending you has long-term goals, that's the number one thing. You've got to fit within that long-term structure and goal and strategy. And I served in 2 different churches and polar opposites of the short-term mission debate. One of them, short-term mission was for the sole purpose of discipleship and making sure that the attendee, the short-term missionary, that participant that's going on there was being mentored and discipled and gets a broader view of the world. Their cultural identity has changed so that they become better Christians here in the world, in the U.S. The other church, the sole mission for going on a short-term mission trip was to benefit the long-term efforts of the missionary that's on the field. So, but each of those churches had specific goals, and these were how the short-term mission trips were supposed to align. So as long as you're in alignment, it works. It makes a difference.
So you would say what makes a worthwhile trip is designing them for the receiver, but also for the goer.
And for the goer.
So a mutual design. How is this trip going to benefit those who go and benefit those who receive them? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. What else would make a short-term mission worthwhile?
I think some other benefits, like you had mentioned this a little bit. I have a friend who I just had a recent conversation with, was a missionary, new and green and having a really hard time getting adjusted to the new culture. And her church was faithful in sending just small trips to her. And they worked alongside of her in the school and all that, but they sent them to her. And that was, she attests their trips and their visits as her longevity on the field.
Wow.
Just those first 6 months where you're just trying to find your feet, they were incredible, and just being able to add to her longevity on the field. And so I think that knowing a focused purpose for why we're going.
Yeah.
And it was the same for us. We were only across the border, but I was pregnant with our second child, had our baby, and this new place, couldn't talk to anyone. And so when we had someone come down and bring like Pink Lady apples from Costco, it was like, oh, and I can talk to you. And so that, if that's one of the purposes, I think that's a huge benefit of short-term missions as well.
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I would say it's always about the relationship, right?
So we keep coming back to that.
If you have someone that you're going to encourage, I was a recipient as well. My first year in Bolivia, I had some friends from my church come, and it was great to have interactions with people who knew me before I was plopped in the middle of a new culture and trying to get my feet on the ground, and an opportunity as well for them to experience what I've been writing to them about, and have them have tangible ways to be in prayer, not just for me, but for the work that I was there to do. I say that was very, very much worthwhile.
All 3 of you have hit on this. I think one of the most effective elements of a short-term mission trip is the encouragement and strengthening of the workers that are on the field, if it's that type of a trip, if you're visiting full-time workers in field. And I think there's a biblical basis for short-term missions. You find it in the book of Philippians. And Paul is in prison, as we know, and he talks about this guy, Epaphroditus, and how he's a fellow worker, a soldier in the truth. I mean, what a great description. He's a fellow worker in the truth. Well, the church in Philippi couldn't, all of them show up and visit Paul. So they sent Epaphroditus on behalf of the church, and they delivered a love gift. And it's really interesting. What Paul says is that he delivered what was lacking in your love for me. This was a short-term mission trip, guys. And it almost sounds like an indictment against the church. He delivered what was lacking in your love for me. Well, there was no love lacking. It was the delivery of the love gift in person. Again, the whole church couldn't go, but they sent this representative, and he brought presence, Presence, not just presence. And it encouraged Paul, and he said, follow his example. And so I think this is often overlooked. It's about, what do we get to do on the field? What are we going to do? What are we going to accomplish? I'm not saying there's not a place for that. But this was a short-term missionary who visited a long-term missionary in jail, right, on the edge, and he brought the gift of presence, the love of the church in Philippi. So give me an idea of what some training and preparation might look like. Let's get really practical with our viewers here, because I think they're seeing some philosophical pieces. We've alluded to things. What would some practical training look like for short-termers so that they can beat the bad rap? Because we're sending a lot of people and spending a lot of money. Let's redeem these things. What does practical preparation for the field, and maybe even after the experience, look like?
I think expectation is key, number one. A short-term team cannot expect to have long-term effectiveness in 1 week.
They're not going to win the whole country?
Okay. In 10 days. And so I think, obviously with the arrogance and it's not necessarily, it is arrogance, but also just a desire. God has put this desire in us to share who he is and what he's done with the world. And so for a short-term team to have that desire, but to really not expect to have the whole country saved in 10 days. And so expectation, I think, is key. Humility, going in as a learner, being at churches, making an effort. If you don't have someone to partner with who's on the ground and who's there and who's going to teach you how to be in that country, don't go. Yeah. Because you could do more harm than good.
You mentioned about the culture, and we all know culture, but we don't always think that we have culture.
Right.
But eliminating stereotypes, or at least exposing stereotypes of what we have. And it's not just the stereotypes of what we have of those folks that we're going to go minister to and meet, but it's also maybe recognizing what their stereotypes of us as the goers are. And there's a neat little exercise where you can just kind of say, what are some both positive and negative stereotypes of what those recipients will think of us when we first arrive. And I remember some of my training for the churches that I worked in was coming in and just saying, all you're taking is a carry-on suitcase. You're going to be gone for 2 weeks on this short-term mission trip. All you're going to take is everything that you need in a carry-on suitcase. And the number one thing that does is it eliminates that initial stereotype that all Americans are materialistic, that we have baggage. They all have these scenarios playing in their minds of North Americans arriving with piles of suitcases and tons of stuff. But if we just arrive simple, humble, and present ourselves as we're here to spend a week or 2 weeks with you, and not be so concerned about our electronics and all of our different sets of clothing that we have. But our first impression is going to be kind of a shock, maybe. And that helps them say, these folks are different than what we expected, and more willing to listen to our message too.
Absolutely.
Apart from the stereotypes, I think it's also key to actually point out things within our culture. Being Western, we are very much task-driven. So we always want to know, what are we going to do? And we want to see the schedule, and then we want to make sure we're on time. Great. And when you get into the context of another culture, they could be more people-oriented. And so, so what if we're 20 minutes over what the schedule says we're supposed to do? We're in relationship, we're in community, and that's valued more. And so, like you said, managing expectations, they need to understand that their expectation of having a tight ship, during their 10 days or however many it is on the field is not likely to happen.
So a friend of mine used to say, breathe in the ambiguity. I mean, in a third world environment, in the developing nation, you don't have the task-driven society as much. It is more relationship-driven. A friend of mine tells a story of a short-term mission trip in Mexico, and they were doing some construction work with national Christians, and so you had the American believers and the Mexican believers working side by side, which is a great example of co-laboring. But the wheelbarrow was a pretty large distance from the place they were getting the concrete and the materials from, and someone complained about it, and my friend nudged him and he said, but you don't understand, for these people, that walk back and forth is all about the conversation. They're not concerned about the efficiency like we are. Yeah. They view this as an opportunity to get to know one another. Yeah. And, it was just a simple illustration of how they weren't really concerned that we get this done immediately as quick as we could. Right. It was all about the building of relationship. Yeah. I would say something that's critical, if I can speak into this as well, not like I already haven't spoken into this topic, but money is a problem. And you talk about the dependency issue. I know many teams that come in and, clothing, food, a couple $1,000s maybe, who knows, and then they leave. They're befriended by a pastor, they fall in love with him, and they hand this guy $500 on the way out of the country, not appreciating the fact that that is the equivalent to maybe multiple months of income and the damage that can create. And it's done with good intentions, a big heart, but they don't think about the implications. Sometimes the help that we think we should give that would benefit is actually harmful, right?
Yeah, and I'm with a missions organization. We do church planting, and we try to get the nationals to take ownership of their church as soon as possible. And it's short cycle. Avant Ministries is about short cycle church planting. And one of the things that happens is in a lot of places that are impoverished, the church planting strategy is find an American partner and they will fund you.
Yeah, that's right.
And that completely wipes away any kind of indigenous-led church planting movement.
Right.
And that right away, the money issue completely takes away anything that we could want to do in that
That's right.
area.
It's not scalable. If that's the model for growing a church, then every single indigenous worker has got to go to the United States and find rich person or whoever, sugar daddy to, to provide resources. So I don't know if you all have read McQuilkin's book, The Great Omission. Robert McQuilkin, he's in heaven right now. He's a great friend and a mentor of mine. But I want to share 4 things as we close here. He says, this is what it takes to make short-term mission trips worthwhile. Orientation 101. Study the culture. Study about the Great Commission. Use this as an opportunity to learn about missions, God's heart for the nations. Reality Therapy 102. He says, die to your Americanism. Be a servant. Abandon the comforts of home. Tutorial 103. Be a listener and a learner. And then he says, Postgraduate 104, we didn't hit on this much, but a re-entry and reflection strategy. And this is what he says, begin to ask God every day, what does this experience mean for my long-term involvement in missions? What does this short-term experience mean for my long-term involvement in missions? So, folks, I really appreciate your insights, your wisdom, and sharing it with us. Thank you so much for being here today.
This episode of The Mission Table was brought to you in partnership with Living Water International. Living Water International is a faith-based nonprofit organization that helps communities in developing countries to create sustainable water, sanitation, and hygiene programs in response to the global water crisis. We would also like to thank our sponsors, Shepherd Staff, Avant, Food for the Hungry, Pioneers, Encountering the World of Islam, Perspectives, Missio Nexus, and Ethnos 360.
What happens to the Great Commission when everything is missions? That's the question Denny Spitters and Matt Ellison ask in their new book, When Everything is Missions. Here's what J.D. Payne says about the book. This brief, powerful, and provocative book should be read by every North American pastor. When Everything is Missions, available now from Denny Spitters and Matt Ellison at wheneverythingismissions.com. That's wheneverythingismissions.com.
This has been The Mission Table, presented by 1615.